Today is Monday, April 11th, 2022. My joy to be coming to you. I'm traveling, as you can see probably in the background. But let's continue our study of the book of Jeremiah, chapter 12 and 13. Now, the title of today's devotional is Making Sense Out of Things That Make No Sense. Now, we pick up our study. The Lord had warned Jeremiah, the citizens of Anathoth, that is his hometown, and how they had plotted to kill him if he continued to prophesy in the name of the Lord. We saw that in Jeremiah 11 and verse 21. And yet the Lord consoled his prophet and declared, I will punish them. The young men shall die by the sword. Their sons and daughters shall die by famine. And there shall be no remnant of them, that is, no heirs of their households. For I will bring evil upon the men of Anathoth. And so we have this terrible, tragic prophecy against the neighbors of Jeremiah's own hometown, the village in which he had grown up and lived. Now that brings me, as we open our Bible and study together Jeremiah 12, that the reality is we look at verses 1 through 2 that sometimes things make no sense. Notice then that Jeremiah 12 opened with the prophet questioning the long-suffering, the patience of the Lord, and asking this question, verse 1 of Jeremiah 12. Wherefore, or that is why doth the way of the wicked prosper? You know, most reading this devotional have probably had the same question. Why do the righteous seem to suffer, and the wicked who despise God's law and commandments seem to suffer no consequences? And the prophet reasoned in verse 1 with the Lord and said, Lord, I know that you're righteous and just, but why have you planted the wicked who flourish like a fruit-bearing tree? In verse 2. Jeremiah went on and he defended his assertion in verse 2 and contending that the wicked often make a pretense of spirituality with their mouths. Lord, they say one thing, but behold, their hearts are far from you. And then in verses 3 and 4, the prophet seems to propose, or even one might say defend, his integrity in contrast to the wicked. Now, after he had observed how the wicked appear to enjoy favor, Jeremiah pled in verse 3, Lord, you know me. You've observed my ways. You've tried the sincerity of my heart. And understanding there were those who desired to harm him, Jeremiah called on the Lord, judge the wicked, saying, verse 3, pull them out like sheep for the slaughter. He reasoned, why shall the land and its inhabitants suffer while the wicked appear to go unpunished? Well, Jeremiah 12 verses 5 through 6 says what I would describe as good news, bad news. The good news, the Lord answered Jeremiah's grievances. The bad news, he answered it with two parables that really admonished Jeremiah to prepare himself for greater trials and sorrows. If you'll notice in Jeremiah 12 and verse 5, the first parable suggests, should a man complain of being wearied when he has only run with men? Surely he will never aspire to run with horses. Now, that's a parable. Let's continue. Notice also in verse 5, the second parable. It suggested there were some in Judah who whined of their state, even though they had been living in peace and prosperity. And the observation of the Lord is surely their faith and courage would fail when trouble comes like the swelling waters of the Jordan River in season. I'm going to borrow a 21st century adage. The inference of both of these parables was for Jeremiah. It might be summed up with this, and I'm going to give a modern adage. Fasten your seatbelt, Jeremiah. Things are going to get much worse. Well, indeed they did. As you look at verses 5 and 6, the news would get much worse. In fact, it was followed in verse 6 by the revelation that Jeremiah's own brethren, the people of his own father's household, had actually joined league with his enemies that wanted to kill him. And so the Lord warned Jeremiah in verse 5 that when it came to his family, believe them not, though they might even speak unto you fair words. Now notice Jeremiah 12, verses 7 through 13. And I'm calling this Jeremiah's lamentation. By this time in his ministry, I believe that Jeremiah had become the lone voice for the Lord in Judah. Josiah, I believe, and other contemporary scholars of our day believe, that Josiah, most likely his contemporary prophet in Judah, was dead. And so here we have Jeremiah. He faced a people who would not turn from their idols, whose sins demanded God's judgment. And in fact, he goes back again and deals with this thought of the pastors, but this time it's going to be the pastors or the leaders of the heathen country. Now, you realize, as we noticed in an earlier study, that the pastors, the civic and the spiritual leaders of Judah had failed the people, and their lands and their crops would be destroyed. Now we read in verses 10 and 11 by other pastors, the leaders of Babylon. In fact, Jeremiah prophesied, many pastors have destroyed my vineyard, looking ahead prophetically. They have trodden my portion, my land, my inheritance underfoot. They have made a pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. In other words, that which was good, they have destroyed. In fact, quite honestly, it sounds a lot like today's politicians. That which was great and that which was good about my country has been systematically destroyed, I believe, by the enemies of the country, who are actually the leaders of the country. Notice then a closing thought. Our devotional in Jeremiah 12 concludes with the Lord promising the day would come when he would remember his people. And in verse 15, and he would have compassion on them and would bring them again, every man to his heritage, every man to his land. And verse 17, nevertheless, true to God's covenant with Israel, Jeremiah warned, if the people would not obey the Lord, he would pluck them up and destroy that nation, saith the Lord. I close inviting you. It's time for us to call out on the Lord and ask for his mercy and his grace. For there are enemies in my country, and perhaps if you're in another country, enemies in your country that are wanting to destroy all that is good. And may God help us in the day of judgment. Thank you for joining me, and bye-bye.